Hello everyone, welcome to video number 2 of AP Computer Science A. Have you wondered what public and static mean in the main method? Well, that's what we're going to explore today. So let's create a new class. Let's suppose that we're trying to simulate a game and we want the class to keep track of all of the players. So we can name the class player. So suppose the game works by keeping track of how many points each player has, and whoever has the most points at the end wins. So in that case, we need a variable for each player which stores how many points they have. Alright, so far we don't have any constructor here, and you might be wondering, can we create an object without the constructor? And the answer is yes. Because if there is no constructor seen, then Java uses the default constructor. And what the default constructor is it takes no parameters and it sets each variable to its default value. So the default value for int is 0, so therefore if we create an object right now, then it would set points to 0. Or if we say points equals 2, then it would set points to 2 if we try to create an object. But it doesn't make sense for somebody to enter a game with more than 0 points, so let's just keep it like this. So now let's create an object. I'm going to name the player Jack. Alright, so let's first print out how many points Jack has to verify everything I've said so far. Right, it prints out 0, which is correct. So now suppose that Jack earns 4 points. So Jack.points plus equals 4. Then let's print it out again. Alright, it prints out 4. So now, what if we changed this variable to a private variable? Well, public variables, they can be accessed anywhere. So they can be accessed in the main class, as well as the class that they were created in. So by doing Jack.points here, there's no problem. But if we set this variable to private variable, then it can only be accessed and modified in the class that it's created in. So then in this case, trying to do Jack.points in the main class wouldn't work. As you can see, it's already highlighted in red. And if we run it, then it will give out errors. So the only place that you can use private variables is inside the class that they're created in. So let's suppose that we make a method. I'm going to call this method method 1 for simplicity. Alright, and then suppose that we did points plus equals 4 inside this method. This would work because even though points is private, we're using it in the same class that it's created in. So now if we did Jack.method1, then this line would work. And of course the code wouldn't work still because there's still these two appearances of Jack.points, but this line, there's nothing wrong with it. So now you can also make private methods. So if we make this method private, then it can only be used inside of this class. So now doing Jack.method1 in the main class would not work. So how you can use private methods is if we create another method. I'm going to call this method 2. And inside this method, we do method 1. Then this would work because we're calling the method in the same class that it's created in. So then if we do Jack.method2 in the main class, then this line of code would have no problems. Alright, so there are two important methods that have to do with private variables that you need to remember for AP Computer Science A. They are setters and getters. So I'm going to erase this. So you cannot modify private variables outside of the class that they're created in directly, but you can if you have setters and getters. So create the method. So the access type needs to be public because otherwise you can't use the setter or getter in another class anyway, so it's a waste. And then let's do setters first. So the return type would be void, and the naming convention would be set and then the variable name, except the first letter is capitalized. And then the parameter, so you take one parameter in, and the type of the parameter is the same as the variable type for the variable. All right, and what you say is you say points equals A. So now if we do jack.setPoints to 4, then this would work. And now as for getters, those are used to access the value of a variable. So you do public, and the return type is the variable type of the variable. So the naming convention is similar. It's get, and then the name of the variable with the first letter capitalized, and there are no parameters, and then the body would just be return point. So then now if we do jack.getPoints, then this should work. All right, it does. And now keep in mind that this method right over here, it sets the number of points to 4. It doesn't increase the number of points by 4. So if we wanted to increase the number of points by 4, then we would do jack.getPoints. That's how many points he currently has, plus 4. And it gives the same output, but if Jack had a different number of points before we called this method, for example, if he had 2 points before calling this method, then it would give a different output. All right, so I'm just going to create another method. I'm going to call it earn points. And the parameter would just be points earned. So this method, it will just increase the number of points by the points earned. And we don't really need this method, but it will just make it simpler. We don't have to use like set points and get points all in one. So we can just do jack.earn points and 4. All right, so now we're done with public and private. So now we're getting into what static and instance are. So notice how in this method right over here we see public and static, but in all of these methods we don't see static or instance. And the reason for that is because instance is the default. So if you don't write anything, then it's instance. But if you write static here, then it would change the variable to a static variable. So what instance variables are variables related to objects, and static variables are related to the class. So points, they would be instance because every player would have a different number of points. If we made points a static variable, then everyone would have the same number of points, and that doesn't make sense. But now let's suppose that we want to create teams. So in that case, let's make some more variables. So string, so I'm going to call it team. And then let's create some more variables. Private int. So let's suppose we have 2 teams and we want one variable to keep track of how many points the red team has. and we want one variable to keep track of how many points the blue team has. Alright, so we can make these two variables static because they are related to the class. It's not like every player would have a different number of red team points and blue team points. They are the same they are related to the class. So therefore we can make these two variables static. Alright, and now let's create some more objects inside this class. And before we do that, we actually need a constructor. So I'm going to call it public here, and we need to take a string as the parameter, and we set team to whatever the parameter is. And since we haven't mentioned points, it still sets points to the default value, which is 0. Alright, so now let's suppose that Jack is part of the red team. And I'm going to make some more players. Alright, so, and I made a mistake here. This should be a lowercase p. Alright, so now if we do, so now we should modify the earn points method. So other than just increasing the number of points the player has, we should also increase how many points their team has. So we can do if team equals red, then red team points plus equals points. Otherwise, blue team points plus equals points earned. Alright, and then let's call these methods a few times. So suppose Jack earns 50 points. And then Shirley earns 60 points. Alright, so now red team points, the value of that is set to 50, and then blue team points is 60. And it's the same for every object. So now let's create a method. So by creating this method, I'm going to show you the difference between a static and an instance method. So static methods, they are related to the class. And instance methods, they are related to objects. So in all of these methods, we did points, and these are all instance methods because we use instance variables inside of these methods. So if we are going to create a static method, and therefore we cannot use points because points is an instance variable, and we cannot use instance variables inside of static methods. So I'm going to call this method game over. Right, and then if the game is over, let's just print whoever wins. Right, so if red has more points than blue, then we print out red wins. And if they're tied, Then we print out tie. And if blue has more points, then we print out blue wins. Alright, so now let's also print out how many points each team has. Alright, so now let's call this method. So we can just do player.gameOver. The static methods, they allow you to just do the name of the class.gameOver. You don't have to say an object and then .gameOver. So that's the benefit that static methods have over instance methods. The drawback is that you can't use instance variables inside of static methods. Alright, so this is pretty much it. Here is an optional exercise. Create a class called bank account, which has the private int variables checking account balance, saving account balance, and accounts created, as well as the private string variable password. Create the constructor and decide whether each variable should be static or instance. Create the setter and getter for at least one variable. And you do not need to create any objects for the exercise. You can if you want to. So if you want to give this a try, then pause the video here and then keep watching for the solution. Here is the solution. So first of all, which variables should be static and instance? Well, checking account balance, saving account balance, and password should be instance because they're different for each person. And finally, accounts created should be static because it's related to the bank, not each individual person. And for the constructor, you need to take in 3 parameters, one for each instance variable, and set each variable to the corresponding parameter. And how do we keep track of the number of accounts created? Well, each time the constructor is called, a new account is created. So therefore, inside the constructor, we could just say accounts created plus plus. And now for the setter and getter, I'm going to make it for the variable password. So first, for the setter, we need to take a parameter and set the password to that parameter. And as for the getter, we need to return the password. And I made a typo here. This should be account. And now this is the solution. So we're finished. So today you learned about what public, private, static, and instance mean. And if you have time, I encourage you to experiment around and make your own projects. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in video number 3.